Most people wake up every morning waiting for a feeling, waiting for energy, waiting for excitement, waiting for inspiration, waiting for that invisible switch inside their chest to flip before they finally move. But here's the brutal truth no one taught you. Motivation is not a reliable force. It is not stable. It is not loyal. It is not consistent. And if your life depends on motivation, your life will stay inconsistent too, because motivation is a reaction to emotion, to mood, to environment, to comfort. And emotions change like weather. One moment you feel unstoppable. The next moment you feel exhausted, distracted, unsure. And if your action depends on how you feel, then your results will depend on randomness, not power, not structure, not intention. And randomness never builds greatness. Randomness builds chaos, and chaos builds regret. And this is why most people start strong and finish nowhere, because motivation gives you a spark, but discipline gives you fire. Motivation gives you hype, but discipline gives you heat. Motivation gives you beginnings, but discipline gives you endings. And winners understand something losers never do. You don't rise to the level of your motivation. You fall to the level of your systems, habits, and standards. And if your standard is, I act when I feel good, then your standard is weak. But if your standard is, I act because I decided, then your standard is unbreakable, because discipline is not about forcing yourself to suffer. It is about training yourself to move without emotional permission. It is about becoming the kind of person who does not negotiate with resistance, who does not wait for clarity before taking action, who does not wait for confidence before stepping forward, because confidence is built through movement, not meditation. Clarity is built through execution, not contemplation. And strength is built through pressure, not comfort. And this is the moment you must realize something life-changing. The reason your dreams feel heavy is not because they are too big. It is because your discipline is too small. The reason your goals feel far is not because they are unreachable. It is because your daily actions are disconnected from them, and discipline is the bridge between intention and reality. It is the invisible structure that turns vision into outcome. But most people reject discipline because they misunderstand. They think discipline means restriction, punishment, suffering, pain, boredom. But discipline is actually freedom. It is freedom from procrastination, freedom from anxiety, freedom from self-doubt, freedom from chaos, freedom from regret. Because when you live discipline, your future becomes predictable. And predictability is power. Unpredictability is stress, and stress destroys focus, energy, confidence, and clarity. And the truth is, motivation is seductive because it feels good. It feels like progress without pain. It feels like movement without discomfort. It feels like success without sacrifice. But motivation without discipline is fantasy. And fantasy does not pay bills. Fantasy does not build strength. Fantasy does not create legacy. Fantasy creates disappointment, because feelings alone cannot carry weight, and life is heavy, responsibility is heavy, goals are heavy, growth is heavy, and only discipline can lift weight consistently, because discipline does not care how you feel, it cares what must be done. And that shift alone separates adults from children, leaders from followers, builders from dreamers, because discipline is maturity in action. It is saying, I will do what I said I would do even when I no longer feel like doing it. And that single decision changes everything, because when you stop relying on feelings, you start relying on identity. And identity is more powerful than emotion, because emotion fluctuates, but identity stabilizes. Emotion fades, but identity endures. Emotion hesitates, but identity executes. And once you decide, I am the K, in the person who shows up, your behavior changes automatically, not through force, but through alignment, because the brain will always try to stay consistent with who it believes you are. And if you believe you are disciplined, your actions will follow. But if you believe you need motivation, your actions will hesitate. And hesitation is the birthplace of failure, not because hesitation is wrong, but because hesitation creates delay. Delay creates doubt. Doubt creates fear. Fear creates avoidance. Avoidance creates stagnation. And stagnation creates regret. And regret is the heaviest emotion a human can carry, heavier than pain, heavier than fear, heavier than exhaustion, because regret is pain without purpose, and discipline is pain with purpose. Discipline is discomfort with direction. Discipline is struggle with structure. Discipline is effort with outcome. And this is why disciplined people do not complain about hard work. They understand that difficulty is not a signal to stop. It is a signal to grow. Resistance is not a wall. It is a doorway. Pressure is not a threat. It is a forge, and comfort is not safety. Comfort is decay, because anything that does not grow dies, and growth does not happen in comfort. Growth happens in tension, in challenge, in strain, and discipline is how you voluntarily place yourself in controlled tension so that life does not crush you with uncontrolled pressure. And most people live backwards. They avoid discipline and then suffer chaos. They avoid structure and then drown in disorder. They avoid effort and then collapse under consequences. But disciplined people reverse this. They choose effort early so they avoid pain later. They choose discomfort now so they avoid regret later. They choose structure now so they gain freedom later. And freedom is the ultimate reward of discipline, not success, not money, not fame, but freedom. Freedom to move, freedom to choose, freedom to breathe, freedom to sleep without anxiety, freedom to wake without dread, freedom to walk into rooms without fear, freedom to look at yourself in the mirror without disappointment. And that freedom is built one disciplined action at a time, one hard decision at a time, one uncomfortable hour at a time. And that is why winners do not wait to feel ready, because readiness is a myth. No one ever feels fully ready, not before starting a business, not before chasing a dream, not before stepping into leadership, not before changing their body, not before changing their life, because readiness is a feeling and feelings are unreliable, but commitment is a decision, and decisions create momentum, and momentum creates readiness, not the other way around. And if you want proof, look at every successful person you admire. They did not start confident. They did not start certain. They did not start fearless. They started uncertain, insecure, afraid, and confused, but they moved anyway, and movement changed them. Action reshaped their identity. Execution rewired their nervous system. Repetition built their strength, and discipline transformed their doubt into belief, their fear into fuel, their weakness into power. And this is the moment you must realize something uncomfortable but liberating. Motivation is optional. Discipline is mandatory. Motivation is a luxury. Discipline is a necessity. Motivation is weather. Discipline is climate. Motivation is mood. Discipline is law, and laws outlast moods. And if you build your life on moods, your life will collapse under pressure. But if you build your life on laws, your life will stand under storms, and storms will come, setbacks will come, losses will come, exhaustion will come, disappointment will come, but discipline will still stand. And when everything else falls apart, discipline will remain. And that is why disciplined people are dangerous, not because they are aggressive, but because they are reliable. And reliability is rare, and rare things are powerful, because when you can rely on yourself, the world cannot stop you. When you can rely on yourself, you no longer fear failure, because failure is just feedback. And feedback is fuel, and fuel feeds growth, and growth compounds, and compounding changes destiny. And destiny is not decided in big moments. It is decided in small, boring, invisible moments when no one is watching, when nothing is trending, when nothing feels exciting, when nothing feels rewarding. And that is where discipline lives, in the unseen hours, in the uncelebrated reps, in the unnoticed effort. And that is why discipline creates champions and motivation creates starters. And starters are everywhere, but finishers are rare. And finishers change the world, not because they are special, but because they stay, because they persist, because they endure, because they do not wait to feel good before doing good. And if you can understand this, not intellectually, but behaviorally, not emotionally, but structurally, not temporarily, but permanently, then your life will change, not suddenly, but steadily, not dramatically, but inevitably, because discipline does not explode results, it compounds them, and compounding is invisible until it is unstoppable. And when it becomes unstoppable, people call it talent, people call it luck, people call it genius. But it was never any of those things. It was discipline in disguise. Discipline repeated long enough to look like magic. Discipline practiced long enough to look like destiny. Discipline executed long enough to look like fate. And fate is nothing more than habits repeated, and habits are nothing more than discipline automated. And this is why winners don't wait to feel ready, because readiness is an emotion, and emotions fade. But discipline is a structure, and structures endure. And the moment you stop asking, how do I feel, and start asking, what must be done, your life upgrades instantly. Not because the world changes, but because you change. And when you change, everything changes. Because the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your daily actions. Not your intentions, not your desires, not your dreams, not your goals, but your actions. And actions are driven by discipline, not motivation. And if you master that one principle, you will outperform people who are smarter than you, more talented than you, more connected than you, more privileged than you, because discipline outworks talent when talent does not work. Discipline outlasts motivation when motivation fades. Discipline outperforms emotion when emotion fluctuates. And discipline wins always, not loudly, not dramatically, not instantly, but inevitably. And inevitability is the most dangerous force in the world, because what is inevitable cannot be stopped. And discipline makes success inevitable. Not guaranteed, not easy, not fast, but inevitable. And that is the only promise worth chasing, because easy fades, fast crashes, guaranteed breeds entitlement, but inevitable builds strength, resilience, identity, and character. And character sustains success when success arrives. And many people fail not because they cannot reach success, but because they cannot sustain it. And discipline is what sustains. Discipline is what stabilizes. Discipline is what protects. Discipline is what preserves. And without discipline, success becomes chaos. But with discipline, chaos becomes order. And order becomes power. And power becomes freedom. And freedom becomes legacy. And legacy is not what people say about you when you die. Legacy is what you build inside yourself while you live. The standards you hold, the habits you maintain, the character you embody, the strength you develop, the discipline you practice. And this is the truth. No one is coming to save you. No one is coming to motivate you every day. No one is coming to push you when you feel tired. No one is coming to force you to become your best self. That responsibility belongs to you, and discipline is how you accept it. Discipline is self-respect in action. Discipline is self-love in motion. Discipline is self-belief expressed through behavior. And if you say you believe in yourself but you do not act, that belief is a lie. Because belief without action is fantasy. And fantasy does not change lives, but discipline does. And the moment you stop waiting to feel ready and start moving anyway, you enter a different class of human being, not better than others, but more reliable than your past self. And that is the only comparison that matters. Because the goal is not to beat others. The goal is to beat yesterday's version of you. And discipline is how you do that, not once, not occasionally, not when it feels good, but daily, consistently, relentlessly. And if you do that long enough, your life will no longer be defined by what you want. It will be defined by what you do. And what you do will define who you become. And who you become will define what you achieve. And what you achieve will define the life you live. And the life you live will define the impact you leave. And impact is the highest form of success. Not wealth, not fame, not applause, but impact, because impact means you change something, someone, somewhere, somehow, because you disciplined yourself when others didn't. And that is the ultimate victory, not over others, but over your own excuses, your own resistance, your own fear, your own comfort, your own past. And once you win that battle, the world becomes negotiable, circumstances become flexible, limits become illusions, and obstacles become invitations. And that is why winners do not wait to feel ready, because readiness is a feeling, and feelings lie, but discipline is a decision, and decisions shape destiny, and destiny favors the discipline. Discipline is not about willpower, and that misunderstanding destroys more potential than laziness ever could, because willpower is finite, emotional, fragile, and unreliable. But discipline is structural, neurological, trainable, and compounding. And once you understand how discipline actually works inside your brain, you stop trying to force yourself and start building systems that move you automatically. Because the human brain is not designed to make hard decisions constantly. It is designed to conserve energy, minimize risk, and seek comfort, which means your default setting is avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of effort, avoidance of uncertainty. And that is not weakness, that is biology. But biology does not determine destiny unless you allow it to. And discipline is how you override biology with identity, structure, and repetition. Because every action you take strengthens a neural pathway. And every pathway you strengthen becomes easier to activate. And every pathway you weaken becomes harder to access. Which means discipline is not just something you do, it is something you become. Because repeated disciplined actions literally reshape your brain, increasing gray matter in areas responsible for self-regulation, focus, emotional control, and delayed gratification, while weakening pathways associated with impulsivity, distraction, and avoidance. And that is why discipline feels hard at first, but easy later, because in the beginning, you are fighting your own wiring. But over time, you are rewiring it, and eventually discipline becomes your default state, not through force, but through familiarity, because your brain begins to recognize disciplined behavior as normal, expected, and safe. And comfort is not about ease, it is about familiarity, which means your brain will eventually feel more comfortable working than procrastinating, more comfortable training than resting, more comfortable executing than hesitating if you repeat disciplined actions long enough. And that is why successful people look effortless from the outside, not because it is easy, but because it is familiar. And familiarity removes friction. And friction is what drains energy, not effort. And most people are exhausted not because they work hard, but because they fight themselves all day. They battle indecision. They battle procrastination. They battle guilt. They battle doubt. They battle resistance. And that internal war drains more energy than execution ever could. But discipline eliminates internal conflict by pre-deciding behavior. And pre-decision is power. Because when you decide in advance what you will do, you remove choice in the moment. And when you remove choice in the moment, you remove hesitation. And hesitation is the enemy of momentum. And momentum is the engine of success. Because motion creates emotion, not the other way around. Action creates motivation, not motivation creates action. And this reverses everything you were taught. Because society teaches you to wait for desire before effort. But discipline teaches you to apply effort before desire. And effort generates desire, because the brain rewards movement with dopamine, not intention. And dopamine is not the chemical of pleasure, it is the chemical of pursuit, of progress, of momentum. And this is why action energizes you, not rest. Movement fuels motivation, not waiting. And once you understand this, you stop asking, how do I feel? And start asking, what can I do right now? Because doing something changes how you feel, but waiting to feel something changes nothing. And this is the secret of discipline. It is not emotional strength. It is neurological leverage. It is hacking your own brain by understanding how it works and working with it instead of against it, because the brain does not want big goals. It wants small wins, and discipline is built through small wins stacked daily, because small wins produce dopamine. Dopamine reinforces behavior. Reinforced behavior becomes habit. And habits become identity, and identity becomes destiny. And that is not philosophy, that is neuroscience. And most people fail not because they are weak, but because they are trying to change behavior without changing structure, trying to change results without changing systems, trying to change outcomes without changing inputs. And discipline is not about heroic effort, it is about intelligent design. It is about making the right behavior the easiest behavior and making the wrong behavior the hardest behavior, because the brain always chooses the path of least resistance. And if your environment makes bad choices easy and good choices hard, you will fail regardless of motivation. But if your environment makes good choices easy and bad choices hard, you will succeed regardless of motivation. And this is why disciplined people design their lives differently. They design routines that remove friction from success and add friction to failure. They remove distractions from their environment. They automate decisions. They standardize behavior. They ritualize execution, because rituals bypass emotion. And emotion is the enemy of consistency, not because emotion is bad, but because emotion is variable, and variability kills reliability, and reliability is the foundation of success. Because success is not built on rare heroic efforts. It is built on common, consistent behaviors repeated daily, and discipline is the system that makes that repetition possible. And repetition is the mother of mastery, and mastery is the foundation of confidence, and confidence fuels action, and action reinforces discipline, and the cycle continues, upward, compounding, unstoppable. But most people never enter this cycle because they're stuck in the motivation loop, waiting to feel good before acting, and acting rarely, and therefore never rewiring their brain, and therefore always struggling, and therefore always frustrated, and therefore always stuck. And they mistake this struggle for laziness or lack of talent or lack of opportunity, when in reality it is lack of structure, lack of systems, lack of discipline. And discipline is not something you are born with, it is something you build, like muscle, through progressive overload, through repetition, through discomfort, through consistency. And just like muscle, discipline grows when you challenge it slightly beyond its current capacity, not when you overwhelm it, not when you avoid it, but when you train it. And training requires repetition, not intensity. And most people fail because they aim for intensity, not consistency. They try to overhaul their life in one day instead of upgrading it one habit at a time. And intensity burns out, but consistency compounds. And compounding is the most powerful force in the universe, because compounding turns small efforts into massive outcomes over time, but only if those efforts are repeated. And repetition requires discipline, and discipline requires structure. And structure requires systems, and systems require design, and design requires intention, and intention requires awareness, and awareness begins when you realize that motivation is not your problem, your systems are, your structure is, your standards are, your environment is, your habits are, and discipline is the tool that redesigns all of them, not through force, but through alignment, because discipline aligns your actions with your values, and values drive identity, and identity drives behavior, and behavior drives outcomes, and outcomes reinforce identity, and the loop strengthens. And this is why disciplined people feel grounded, stable, calm, confident, not because life is easy, but because their behavior is consistent. And consistency creates trust, and trust creates peace, and peace creates power, because when your mind is not fighting itself, your energy becomes available for execution, and execution creates progress, and progress creates momentum, and momentum creates confidence, and confidence creates courage, and courage creates expansion, and expansion creates opportunity, and opportunity creates growth, and growth creates fulfillment, and fulfillment creates meaning, and meaning is the highest human experience, not pleasure, not comfort, not entertainment, but meaning, because meaning comes from growth, and growth comes from challenge, and challenge requires discipline, and discipline is the bridge between potential and purpose, and most people never cross that bridge because they are waiting to feel like crossing it. But the bridge only appears when you step. And stepping requires discipline, not motivation. And this is the paradox of progress. You must act before you feel ready. You must move before you feel confident. You must begin before you feel prepared. And the feeling follows the action, not the other way around. And this is not motivational talk, it is biological reality, because the brain changes in response to behavior, not intention, and intention without behavior is fantasy, and fantasy does not change neural pathways, but behavior does, and changed pathways change identity, and changed identity changes destiny, and destiny is not written in stars, it is written in habits, and habits are written in discipline, and discipline is written in daily decisions, and daily decisions compound into life outcomes, and life outcomes become your story, and your story becomes your legacy. And legacy is not what you say you want to do, it is what you actually did. And discipline is the difference between intention and execution, between desire and reality, between potential and performance, between vision and victory. And the reason discipline feels heavy at first is because you are carrying the weight of who you used to be, but keep going, because eventually discipline carries you. And that is when life changes, not suddenly, but steadily, not explosively, but inevitably, because discipline does not promise speed, it promises direction, and direction sustained long enough becomes destiny, and destiny is not a place, it is a pattern, and the pattern of disciplined action produces the pattern of success, and the pattern of success produces the pattern of freedom, and freedom produces peace, and peace produces power, and power produces impact, and impact produces legacy, and legacy is the ultimate return on discipline, not money, not fame, not applause, but becoming the kind of person who can be trusted with their own potential, and that is the highest achievement any human can reach, because the greatest betrayal is not of others, it is of yourself, and discipline is how you stop betraying yourself and start becoming yourself, and once that happens, nothing can stop you except you, and discipline removes that obstacle too, not by force, but by structure, not by emotion, but by repetition, not by motivation, but by design, and that is why discipline is not a personality trait, it is a skill, and skills can be trained, and trained skills become strengths, and strengths create leverage, and leverage creates momentum, and momentum creates inevitability, and inevitability creates success, and success sustained becomes legacy, and legacy begins with discipline, and discipline begins with one decision to act regardless of how you feel, and that single decision, repeated daily, rewires your brain, reshapes your identity, and redirects your life. And that is why winners do not wait to feel ready, because they understand readiness as a feeling, and feelings follow behavior, not lead it, and discipline is behavior by design, not by emotion, and design beats desire every time. Most people try to change their life by changing their goals. But goals do not change lives. Identities do, because goals are external targets, but identity is internal structure. And behavior flows naturally from identity, not from desire. And this is why people can want something deeply and still not do what it takes to get it. Because wanting is emotional, but identity is structural. And structure always beats emotion, because emotion fluctuates, but structure persists. And discipline is the mechanism through which identity is built, not declared, because identity is not what you say about yourself, it is what you repeatedly do. And repetition is discipline in motion, and discipline is identity in formation. And most people try to motivate themselves into change. But motivation does not change identity, behavior does, and behavior requires discipline. And discipline requires decision, and decision requires clarity, and clarity requires honesty. And honesty begins when you stop lying to yourself about why you are stuck. Because you are not stuck because you lack talent, intelligence, resources, or opportunity. You are stuck because your identity is misaligned with your goals. And discipline is how you realign them, not by wishing, but by doing, not by thinking, but by acting, not by dreaming, but by executing. And every time you execute when you do not feel like it, you cast a vote for a new identity, and identity is nothing more than the accumulation of votes, not intentions, not affirmations, not visualizations, but actions. And this is why discipline is so powerful, because discipline forces behavior, and behavior forces identity change, and identity change forces outcome change, and outcome change forces life change, and life change forces destiny change, and destiny change forces legacy change, and legacy change forces impact change, and impact change forces world change, and world change begins with self-change, and self-change begins with discipline, and discipline begins with one hard decision: to stop negotiating with your feelings, because feelings are not reliable advisors. They are data, not directives, and disciplined people use feelings as information, not instructions, because they understand that feelings are reactions to perception, not reflections of reality, and reality is shaped by behavior, not emotion, and behavior is shaped by discipline, not motivation. And once you understand this, you stop asking, how can I feel more motivated, and start asking, how can I structure my life to make discipline easier? And that is the correct question, because discipline is not about heroic willpower, it is about intelligent design, and design beats desire every time. And this is why disciplined people do not rely on mood. They rely on routine, they rely on systems, they rely on standards, they rely on rituals, because rituals bypass emotion. And emotion is the enemy of consistency, and consistency is the engine of success. And success is not built in moments of inspiration, it is built in moments of repetition. And repetition builds mastery, and mastery builds confidence, and confidence builds courage, and courage builds action, and action builds results, and results reinforce identity, and identity reinforces discipline, and the cycle strengthens, upward, compounding, unstoppable. And this is why disciplined people appear confident, calm, and controlled, not because they have fewer problems, but because they have fewer internal conflicts, because their behavior aligns with their values. And alignment creates peace, and peace creates power, and power creates performance, and performance creates progress, and progress creates momentum, and momentum creates inevitability, and inevitability creates success, and success sustained creates legacy, and legacy creates meaning, and meaning is the highest human reward. Not pleasure, not comfort, not entertainment, but meaning, because meaning comes from growth, and growth comes from challenge. And challenge requires discipline. And discipline is the tool through which you grow, not just externally, but internally, not just financially, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and socially, because discipline shapes your character, and character shapes your destiny, and destiny shapes your life, and your life shapes your impact, and your impact shapes the world, and the world is shaped not by people who feel motivated, but by people who are disciplined, because discipline is predictable, and predictability is power, because what is predictable can be trusted, and what can be trusted can be built upon, and what can be built upon can scale, and what can scale can change systems, and what can change systems can change societies, and societies are changed by people who show up consistently, not occasionally, and consistency is discipline over time, and discipline over time becomes identity, and identity over time becomes destiny, and destiny over time becomes legacy, and legacy over time becomes impact, and impact over time becomes meaning, and meaning over time becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment is the deepest human satisfaction, not happiness, not excitement, not pleasure, but fulfillment, because fulfillment means you lived in alignment with your potential, and alignment requires discipline, because potential without discipline is frustration, and frustration without discipline becomes resentment, and resentment without discipline becomes bitterness, and bitterness without discipline becomes regret, and regret is the heaviest emotional burden a human can carry, heavier than pain, heavier than fear, heavier than failure, because regret is pain without purpose, and discipline is pain with purpose, and pain with purpose becomes growth, and growth becomes strength, and strength becomes confidence, and confidence becomes courage, and courage becomes action, and action becomes results, and results become evidence, and evidence becomes belief, and belief becomes identity, and identity becomes destiny, and destiny becomes legacy, and legacy becomes impact, and impact becomes meaning, and meaning becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment becomes peace, and peace becomes power, and power becomes freedom, and freedom becomes life, and life lived fully becomes legacy, and legacy begins with discipline, not motivation, not desire, not inspiration, not hype, but discipline, because discipline is the daily practice of becoming who you said you wanted to be, and every time you act when you do not feel like it, you prove to yourself that your identity is not controlled by emotion, and that is the most powerful proof a human can have, because when you trust yourself, you stop fearing yourself, and when you stop fearing yourself, you stop sabotaging yourself, and when you stop sabotaging yourself, you start building yourself, and when you start building yourself, your life upgrades automatically, because your life can never exceed the standards of your identity, and discipline is how you raise those standards, not by wishing, but by acting, not by hoping, but by executing, not by waiting, but by moving. And movement changes everything, not because the world moves, but because you move. And when you move, opportunities appear, momentum builds, confidence grows, clarity sharpens, strength increases, and belief solidifies, and belief becomes certainty, and certainty becomes courage, and courage becomes leadership, and leadership becomes impact, and impact becomes legacy, and legacy becomes meaning, and meaning becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment becomes peace, and peace becomes power, and power becomes freedom, and freedom becomes life, and life lived with discipline becomes unstoppable, because discipline is not limitation, it is liberation, and liberation is the ultimate goal of growth. Not comfort, not ease, not pleasure, but freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from doubt, freedom from regret, freedom from chaos, freedom from inconsistency, freedom from procrastination, freedom from distraction, freedom from mediocrity, freedom from self-betrayal, freedom from wasted potential. And discipline is the key that unlocks that freedom. Not motivation, not inspiration, not hype, but discipline. Because discipline is the practice of honoring your future self in the present moment. And honoring your future self is the highest form of self-love. And self-love is not comfort, it is commitment, not ease. It is effort, not indulgence. It is discipline. And discipline builds identity. And identity builds destiny, and destiny builds legacy, and legacy builds meaning, and meaning builds fulfillment, and fulfillment builds peace, and peace builds power, and power builds freedom, and freedom builds life, and life lived fully begins with discipline, not motivation, not readiness, not confidence, but action. And action begins when you stop waiting to feel ready and start moving anyway. And that is when everything changes. Life will hurt. That is unavoidable. Discomfort is not optional. Struggle is not optional. Difficulty is not optional. Pressure is not optional. Suffering in some form is inevitable, but choice still exists. Not in whether you feel pain, but in which pain you choose. Because there are two types of pain in life, the pain of discipline and the pain of regret. And they feel similar at first, but their outcomes are opposite. Because the pain of discipline weighs ounces, while the pain of regret weighs tons. The pain of discipline burns temporarily, while the pain of regret corrodes permanently. The pain of discipline strengthens, while the pain of regret weakens. The pain of discipline builds, while the pain of regret destroys. The pain of discipline pushes you forward, while the pain of regret traps you in the past. And most people choose the pain of comfort today and inherit the pain of regret tomorrow, while disciplined people choose the pain of discipline today and inherit the pain of growth tomorrow. And growth pain feels different, not because it is pleasant, but because it has purpose. And pain with purpose is tolerable, but pain without purpose is unbearable. And regret is pain without purpose. Regret is suffering with no return. Regret is loss with no lesson. Regret is pain with no progress. And discipline is pain with progress. Discipline is effort with outcome. Discipline is discomfort with direction. Discipline is struggle with structure, and structure transforms chaos into order, and order transforms effort into efficiency, and efficiency transforms time into results, and results transform belief into certainty, and certainty transforms fear into courage, and courage transforms action into impact, and impact transforms life into meaning, and meaning transforms existence into fulfillment, and fulfillment is the deepest human reward, not happiness, not pleasure, not excitement, but fulfillment, because fulfillment means you lived in alignment with your potential, and alignment requires discipline, because potential without discipline becomes frustration, and frustration without discipline becomes resentment, and resentment without discipline becomes bitterness, and bitterness without discipline becomes regret, and regret is the heaviest emotional burden a human can carry, heavier than pain, heavier than fear, heavier than failure, because regret is pain without the possibility of growth, and growth is what makes pain meaningful, and discipline is the tool through which pain becomes growth, not destruction, and that is why disciplined people do not avoid pain. They choose it not because they enjoy suffering, but because they understand that voluntary pain is always lighter than involuntary pain. Voluntary discomfort is always easier to carry than involuntary regret. And disciplined people choose to suffer intentionally so they do not suffer accidentally. They choose to struggle now so they do not struggle later. They choose to work when it is hard so they do not live when it is harder. They choose to train when it is uncomfortable so they do not fail when it is unbearable. And this is not pessimism. This is realism, because life does not reward avoidance. It punishes it, not out of cruelty, but out of consequence, because the laws of cause and effect do not bend to comfort. And comfort is not safety. Comfort is stagnation, and stagnation is decay, because anything that does not grow dies, and growth requires tension, resistance, challenge, and effort. And effort requires discipline, and discipline requires decision, and decision requires clarity, and clarity requires honesty. And honesty begins when you stop lying to yourself about why you are stuck, because you are not stuck, because life is unfair. You are stuck because your habits are misaligned with your goals. And discipline is how you realign them, not through wishful thinking, but through daily action. And daily action compounds, and compounding changes destiny. And Steiny is not built in dramatic moments. It is built in boring days done correctly. And boring days done correctly require discipline. And discipline feels boring because it is repetitive, predictable, structured, routine. And the brain hates boredom, not because boredom is dangerous, but because boredom lacks novelty. And novelty releases dopamine, and dopamine drives motivation, and this is why motivation fades when novelty fades. And discipline is what carries you when novelty disappears, because discipline does not require excitement, it requires commitment. And commitment is deeper than emotion, stronger than mood, more stable than motivation, because commitment is decision repeated, and repeated decisions become habits. And habits become identity, and identity becomes destiny, and destiny becomes legacy, and legacy becomes meaning, and meaning becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment becomes peace, and peace becomes power, and power becomes freedom, and freedom becomes life, and life lived fully requires discipline, not motivation. And this is why winners do not wait to feel ready, because readiness is a feeling, and feelings lie, but discipline is a decision, and decisions shape destiny, and destiny favors the discipline, Not the motivated, not the inspired, not the talented, but the disciplined. Because discipline shows up every day. And showing up every day beats showing up when you feel like it. Because consistency beats intensity, reliability beats brilliance, structure beats spontaneity, execution beats intention, action beats planning, and discipline beats motivation. Always, not loudly, not dramatically, not instantly, but inevitably. And inevitability is the most dangerous force in the world because what is inevitable cannot be stopped, and discipline makes success inevitable. Not easy, not fast, not guaranteed, but inevitable. And inevitability is the only promise worth chasing because easy fades, fast crashes, guaranteed breeds entitlement, but inevitable builds strength, resilience, character, and identity sustains success when success arrives because many people fail not because they cannot reach success, but because they cannot sustain it. And discipline is what sustains. Discipline is what stabilizes. Discipline is what protects. Discipline is what preserves. And without discipline, success becomes chaos. But with discipline, chaos becomes order, and order becomes power, and power becomes freedom, and freedom becomes life, and life lived fully becomes legacy. And legacy begins with discipline, not motivation, not readiness, not confidence, not hype, but discipline, because discipline is the daily choice to do what must be done regardless of how you feel. And that choice, repeated daily, becomes strength. And strength becomes confidence, and confidence becomes courage, and courage becomes action, and action becomes results, and results become evidence, and evidence becomes belief, and belief becomes identity, and identity becomes destiny, and destiny becomes legacy, and legacy becomes meaning, and meaning becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment becomes peace, and peace becomes power, and power becomes freedom, and freedom becomes life, and life lived fully begins with discipline, not motivation, not readiness, not confidence, but action. And action begins when you stop waiting to feel ready and start moving anyway. And that is when everything changes. Talent is overrated. Not because talent is useless, but because talent without discipline is potential without power. And potential without power is frustration. And frustration without discipline becomes bitterness. And bitterness without discipline becomes regret. And regret is the heaviest emotional burden a human can carry. Heavier than pain, heavier than fear, heavier than failure. Because regret is pain without progress. And progress is what makes pain meaningful. And discipline is the tool through which pain becomes progress and progress back. Ohm's growth, and growth becomes strength, and strength becomes confidence, and confidence becomes courage, and courage becomes action, and action becomes results, and results become evidence, and evidence becomes belief, and belief becomes identity, and identity becomes destiny, and destiny becomes legacy, and legacy becomes meaning, and meaning becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment becomes peace, and peace becomes power, and power becomes freedom, and freedom becomes life, and life lived fully begins with discipline, not motivation, not inspiration, not talent, but discipline, because discipline shows up when talent sleeps, discipline works when talent waits, discipline executes when talent hesitates, discipline persists when talent quits, discipline trains when talent rests, discipline repeats when talent retreats, discipline endures when talent complains, discipline grows when talent stagnates, discipline compounds when talent plateaus, and discipline wins, not because it is better, but because it is consistent. And consistency beats brilliance when brilliance is inconsistent, because consistency compounds, and compounding changes destiny. And destiny is not built in breakthroughs, it is built in boring days done correctly. And boring days done correctly require discipline, not talent. Because talent wants excitement, talent wants novelty, talent wants stimulation, talent wants applause, talent wants recognition, talent wants reward, and when reward is delayed, talent loses interest. But discipline does not require reward. Discipline requires commitment, and commitment is stronger than emotion, more stable than mood, more reliable than motivation, because commitment is decision repeated, and repeated decisions become habits, and habits become identity, and identity becomes destiny, and destiny becomes legacy, and legacy becomes meaning, and meaning becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment becomes peace, and peace becomes power, and power becomes freedom, and freedom becomes life, and life lived fully begins with discipline, not talent, not genius, not brilliance, not potential, but discipline, because discipline transforms average into exceptional, ordinary into extraordinary, simple into powerful, basic into brilliant, and discipline is the multiplier that turns effort into excellence, not intensity, not inspiration, not excitement, but repetition, consistency, reliability, and persistence. And persistence is what separates those who start from those who finish. And finishers change the world, not starters, and starters are everywhere, but finishers are rare. And finishers are not rare because they are special. They are rare because they are disciplined. Because discipline is rare. Because most people prefer comfort over commitment, ease over effort, convenience over consistency, pleasure over progress. But disciplined people reverse that equation, not because they enjoy pain, but because they understand the cost of avoidance. And avoidance is expensive, not immediately, but eventually, because avoidance compounds into regret, and regret compounds into bitterness, and bitterness compounds into despair, and despair compounds into resignation, and resignation compounds into mediocrity, and mediocrity compounds into wasted life, and wasted life compounds into regret, and regret is the heaviest burden a human can carry, heavier than pain, heavier than fear, heavier than failure, because regret is pain without growth, and growth is what makes pain meaningful, and discipline is the tool through which pain becomes growth, not destruction. And that is why disciplined people choose to struggle intentionally so they do not suffer accidentally. They choose to work now so they do not regret later. They choose to train when it is hard so they do not fail when it is harder. They choose to be uncomfortable today so they can be free tomorrow. And freedom is the ultimate reward of discipline, not money, not fame, not applause, but freedom free. Dom from anxiety, freedom from chaos, freedom from regret, freedom from doubt, freedom from fear, freedom from procrastination, freedom from distraction, freedom from mediocrity, freedom from self-betrayal, freedom from wasted potential, and discipline is the key that unlocks that freedom. Not motivation, not inspiration, not hype, not talent, but discipline, because discipline is predictable, and predictability is power, because what is predictable can be trusted, and what can be trusted can be built upon, and what can be built upon can scale, and what can scale can change systems, and what can change systems can change societies, and societies are changed by people who show up consistently, not occasionally, and consistency is discipline over time, and discipline over time becomes identity, and identity over time becomes destiny, and destiny over time becomes legacy, and legacy over time becomes impact, and impact over time becomes meaning, and meaning over time becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment over time becomes peace, and peace over time becomes power, and power over time becomes freedom, and freedom over time becomes life, and life lived fully begins with discipline, not talent, not brilliance, not genius, not potential, but discipline, because discipline is the daily practice of becoming who you said you wanted to be, and every time you act when you do not feel like it, you prove to yourself that your identity is not controlled by emotion, and that is the most powerful proof a human can have. Because when you trust yourself, you stop fearing yourself, and when you stop fearing yourself, you stop sabotaging yourself, and when you stop sabotaging yourself, you start building yourself. And when you start building yourself, your life upgrades automatically because your life can never exceed the standards of your identity. And discipline is how you raise those standards, not by wishing, but by acting, not by hoping, but by executing, not by waiting, but by moving. And movement changes everything, not because the world moves, but because you move. And when you move, opportunities appear, momentum builds, confidence grows, clarity sharpens, strength increases, and belief solidifies, and belief becomes certainty, and certainty becomes courage, and courage becomes leadership, and leadership becomes impact. And impact becomes legacy, and legacy becomes meaning, and meaning becomes fulfillment, and fulfillment becomes peace, and peace becomes power, and power becomes freedom, and freedom becomes life, and life lived fully begins with discipline, not motivation, not readiness, not confidence, but action. And action begins when you stop waiting to feel ready and start moving anyway, and that is when everything changes.